Now you have a fire where you actually have still energized lines running through. And so power safety, power shutdowns are becoming more and more common, where a utility has to decide what they're going to shut down to keep the community safe.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 319. Can drones help utility companies reduce the risk of wildfires? Today's guest believes they can. Chris Beaufait serves as the President and Chief Executive Officer for Sharper Shape, the market leader in delivering transformative inspection solutions for the utility industry. Chris is a proven business leader with extensive global experience and joined Sharper Shape from his role as Chief Operating Officer of Sarcos Robotics. Before joining Sarcos, Chris led the Asia, Pacific, and China business as a Group Senior Vice President and President for Vestas, the world's leading wind power and services company. For 16 years before Vestas, he worked for the General Electric Company in a variety of leadership positions. Before GE, Chris served for 11 years in the U.S. Navy as a naval officer and certified nuclear engineer. He also holds multiple Six Sigma certifications. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Chris talks about Sharper Shape, its utility inspection services using drones, and how those services are helping utility companies reduce the risk of wildfires. But before we hear from Chris, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And by the way, if you have a great story on the use of drones that you'd like to share in a podcast, contact me at randy@droneradioshow.com. So let's find out how drones are helping to mitigate the threat of wildfires near utilities with Chris Beaufait of Sharper Shape. Let's pick up the interview where I ask Chris to introduce himself.
Hi, Randy. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Chris Beaufait, and I'm the CEO of Sharper Shape.
Chris, for those that may not be familiar with the company, what is Sharper Shape?
Sharper Shape is a asset intelligence company, but in order to get to that asset intelligence, we use a range of sensors and we use a range of drones to collect aerial data for utility assets. And then all of that goes into a system which creates a digital twin. And then from that, we can do remote inspections. We can help a utility run its utility, and we can do planning, whether it's risk-based planning or operation-based planning, all through our system. And then we also can provide that information to a utility for their legacy system. So we really cover a full circle of services around aerial inspection and data intelligence for the utility sector.
I assume it's primarily the utility sector, or do you do something else other than utilities?
We've done a little bit, but our primary customer base and focus has been the utility sector. We've been around since 2013, and we started actually in Finland as part of the Geospatial Institute there. And so from that, our origins were in the utility sector. So we've been very focused on solving those problems.
Utilities can be a pretty broad term. So what are we actually talking about?
We're talking predominantly the transmission and distribution. And so when you start to think about the 7 million miles of transmission and distribution in the United States, the 8 million in Europe, that's the sort of things that we capture and then put into our systems.
So how does Sharper Shape use drones?
There's a couple aspects. If you think in really large scale data collects, which we've done some of the largest in the world, we've done about 35,000 miles now, about 800,000 structures. And when we talk about those sorts of numbers, there's really two types of inspections. One is where you're doing the large scale, you're trying to capture that information. Typically, that's a LiDAR capture. We'll also do some RGB, some visual captures, and some hyperspectral, we call it. So that will be typically done, say, with a helicopter. A lot of times what will happen is utilities also want a detailed inspection of their structures. And that's where we tend to use the drones. And then where that will probably blur in the future as drones continue to get more and more range and they continue to have more and more time on station, then they can capture and become part of that. The other thing that's happening is the sensors. As an example, there are LiDAR sensors that are being driven to a much smaller size, weight, and power so that drones could help in that aspect in the future as well. So interesting enough, we're a bit an inflection point where today it's helicopters. In the future, it will probably be some mix, and then maybe sometime further down in the future, it could all be done with drones and all with drones automatically. So we're involved in all of those sorts of things.
Are the drones autonomous or do they require pilot control?
Today, they still have a lot of pilot control. And the reason is because of, and it varies by country. And I'm sure given the content of your show, beyond visual line of sight. So due to the beyond visual line of sight requirements, we are only able to automate some aspects of that in certain countries, but we have the tools and the technology to automate more of that. In addition to that, because we are working around, high value, high energy assets, it's a transition not just from a technology perspective, but from a customer perspective, from a community perspective. So we can do full automation, but in practice, we do a mix of either pilots or pilots plus partial automation.
Tell us about the digital twin and what it's used for.
So the digital twin is effectively taking the real world assets and then replicating those in we use a cloud-based environment. So we're architected on an Amazon Web Services backbone. And so we create all of that utility asset base with the structures as well as the areas around the structures. And we recreate all of that, starting with the LiDAR point cloud. And then we turn those LiDAR point clouds into objects, and those objects then become part of a digital model. And then from that digital model, which we call the digital twin, we can now do different types of inspections because in addition to having the LiDAR generated objects and point clouds, we also are now able to tie all of the visual imagery from the drones, as an example, or the helicopter data sensors, and add context to all of this. So we can see, when the picture was taken, the angle it was taken, which asset it was tagged to, and that can then be used by either a field service technician or somebody sitting in operations or a remote inspector to actually assess the state of the utility infrastructure for the areas we've captured. So that gives an idea of both how we get from the aerial flights into the system to how it's used.
Is all the data that's collected, the images, the LiDAR information, and other digital data, is that all imported onto the digital twin? Or are you still working with separate files and separate screens?
We collect it all. So once we've collected it, what we can represent all on one screen is we can represent a 3D model, a 2D model. In a lot of ways, we sort of look a bit like a mix between Google Maps, Google Earth, and then a visual, iPhotos type base, all linked on one screen. So when you look at the 3D model and you rotate that, the 2D map is able to be seen with that, as well as the pictures based upon where you are looking from that model. And then all three models are linked. So a big part of what we do in sort of the tech speak is we use a lot of the meta tagging of the data to add context, regardless of which way you're looking at it, whether you're looking at the picture, you're looking at the 3D model, or you're looking at the 2D images. 2D map, I guess, is a better way to say that.
Is the actual inspection made on the digital twin or while the pilot is out collecting the data?
Both, but typically if a drone pilot or a qualified electrical worker is out in the field and they see something, they can annotate it right in our system. So we also have a full suite of iOS apps that actually tie back into our system. And so one of those is used by a drone pilot. The other is used by the qualified electrical workers. If they see an issue, they can note it in the field. If they don't see it and we collect it, later an inspector can look at it and identify it. And in both cases, it all gets tagged inside the system. And so that's the real power that we bring, is that ability to aggregate large amounts of data from many different participants to, hopefully bring the context that allows them to operate more safely.
And that rolls into my next question. There are many companies that conduct inspections of utilities. What makes Sharper Shape stand out?
It's an interesting question we get asked sometimes. Are we competing with drone collection companies? And sometimes bid to bid, the answer to that is yes. But the reality is, where we really differentiate ourselves is the fact that, yes, we do know how to collect that data. And we had to, because when we started back in 2013, people were not doing the things that we were doing at the scale that's happening today. The reality is, in the process of doing that, we have created some very valuable tools, whether they're tools for collecting and aggregating the data or tools for driving more productivity in how the data is collected. And so I'll give a couple examples to try to add tangibility to that. We can take two pilots, even if they're both very capable pilots. Each utility may want to do what they call a shot sheet differently. We can help them do that more consistently through some of our automation tools. We call that ADI, automatic detail inspection. So that's sort of one thing that we've created that is somewhat unique in the industry. The other piece of it then would be what we call our core software platform. And so we are able to aggregate our data, but also any other data that a utility might have into the same system to add context. And so what that really looks like is, when you start to think about the capability of a company, many of the drone inspection providers were hardware drone companies first, and then they've tried to figure out what to do with the data. We were actually a software company first that had to figure out how to do the service so that we could provide the software services. So we come at the problem from a very different perspective, and I think that's given us a way to solve some problems in a different way.
Did Sharper Shape always provide software services to the utility market?
It originated really providing GIS, geographic information systems type software to the utility sector, and then with a layer of operations on top of that. So that's where we started.
Were helicopters the first step? When did drones start finding their way into the operation?
Interesting enough, and it's, this is where startups, so lots of the journey is part of the excitement. We actually started with drones. Then when we got really large projects, we realized that you have to have helicopters or some other way to capture large scale data. So we've actually been running both in parallel for years now. And that's really something that is also somewhat unique. There are a few others out there who do collection on multiple aerial platforms. Because we started with the software, because we started with the problem, we realized that to solve the problem for the utility, we needed more than one type of collection source.
Let's talk about wildfires and the threat to utilities. First of all, can you describe the nature of the problem?
There are many factors that are coming into play globally. I would say the west coast of the United States, Australia are two of the areas that have been hit the hardest, but it's not limited to those areas. It's been around the world. And the core problem is as climate change continues, what ends up happening is you've got bigger droughts. You've got more, let's say, fuel in the vegetation that is around what are, in effect, high power assets, right? If you look at transmission or distribution, you've got a lot of energy running there. And when those vegetation, whether it's trees or brush or other, come in contact, either through the growth of a tree or a high wind causes something to happen to one of the utility assets, that can spark a fire. And so that's the risk. On top of that, there's another aspect of it. Let's say it wasn't a utility started fire. Let's just say, it was a Mother Nature started fire. Now you have a fire where you actually have still energized lines running through. And so power safety, power shutdowns are becoming more and more common, where a utility has to decide what they're going to shut down to keep the community safe. And of course, if you're not in the area of fire risk, you want to not have your power shut down. And so this becomes risk-based models to figure out where do you really shut down the power. And so we actually have to deal with both sides of that problem. And so that's where we really fall.
How do utility companies use drones to address that situation?
They use a mix of not only drones and not only aerial items. They're really trying to find ways to do what I'd call multi-sensor fusion to be able to have the best intelligence to make these decisions. On the drone side, what they're looking at a lot of times is they need to have a detailed capture of their structures so that they can understand let's call it the state of the infrastructure that they have. And the challenge is, of course, that there are millions of these structures out there. And how do you make sense of that sort of data on that scale? And so to try to put maybe a number to it, that 35,000 miles, 800,000 structures I mentioned equates to 5 petabytes worth of data. So how do you get through 5 petabytes worth of data? And then when you start breaking that down further, some of that is drone data, some of that is, sensors from helicopters, some of that is stationary sensors out in the field, some of that is what qualified electrical workers have done out in the field to capture data. But drones is a part of that whole, call it ecosystem of risk management and safety.
Does Sharper Shape provide any management support in how the utility prioritizes work or repairs?
Mostly we provide the tools that allow their internal departments to provide that, but we've created some automated tools. As an example, we can create automated reports in PDF format, those sorts of things that then can go to the right department. We also think of it as a workflow management tool. So built into the system, as an example, you can go in and say, I saw this at this pole, and it's an urgent item. You select that can then send the information to the right department so that department can immediately get on solving that problem. So we are really providing that set of solutions. And then typically that work is being done by the utility. It could also be done by utility service providers, but for the most part to this day, it's been mostly with the utilities.
So if I understand it correctly, the data not only reveals the condition of the infrastructure, but it can also help to identify whether ground cover conditions are right for a potential fire.
The terminology that they usually use is, they're looking at their infrastructure, their assets. They're also looking at what they call the vegetation or the vegetation management around that. So they do look at both. Where it's extremely helpful is to take a look at, are there automated tools that can show them that there are boundary violations or predicted to be boundary violations in their risk management and vegetation management programs? And that is what our system does. It actually, when we pull all that information into the system, our system will then tell them based upon the criteria, because it does vary a little bit utility by utility. Our system will tell them, these are the areas that violate these boundaries so that you can then plan around that. And then there's typically what they have is risk tiering. There are higher risk areas, and then they, of course, want to attend to those first. And then they have a whole matrix on how that works. And so our system provides information to that system.
Does the data yield some measure of the risk factors? Say the rate of vegetative growth, proximity to residential areas, or other hazardous facilities?
All of the above, but a couple like key examples, and you're definitely on the right path there. One of the items that Sharper Shape has developed, which is maybe unique, you never know, the world's a big place, but we do hyperspectral AI tree species and health determination. So as a factor, one of the things you're trying to figure out is what's the flammability, as an example, of the fuel around those assets. And so if you know the tree species and you know its health and you know its position relative to those assets, you can start to now prioritize which ones are in higher risk areas from a likeliness to create a fire. But then there's also an environmental aspect of some areas are more prone to ignite and spread than other areas, and that's factored into the risk models as well.
For a company like Sharper Shape, what sort of challenges are there in serving the utility industry?
I'll give a couple examples, particularly those that might be a aerial collection side of things. The reality is when you look at transmission and distribution, there's two sides. Transmission are the long straight poles that you see along the highways that are going from generation to use at some point. It's distribution when you get around our homes and houses. And if you think about distribution assets around the world, it's like streets. Pretty much the power lines go to every one of our homes. And so the reality is when we're out there collecting this data with drones, we have to make sure that we've got all of the right planning in place, because the last thing that a utility wants to do is upset the consumer. And we're part of making sure that that doesn't happen when we're doing the collection side of things. And so the other piece that we've done is we've created specific tools around drone flight planning. We've created tools around helicopter flight planning so that either with us or the utility using our tools, we can do that in a way that helps minimize the impact on the community. So it's an interesting thing as you start to peel back the onion, how many different things actually have to be factored in. And we've tried to include that into our core software system. But that's just a real world example. And then there are also the stories that you always hear about having to, run from dogs and all of these things that happen when you're out in the real world.
And I think you mentioned that Sharper Shape is an international company. Is that correct?
That's correct. The technology started in Finland. By legalities, we're a U.S. Delaware company, but the reality is we've got a good number of our teams in Finland. We've got our teams spread throughout the U.S., and then we're in a number of other countries as well, because we're trying to bring together a lot of unique technologies to solve these problems.
How did the pandemic affect the industry and the services that Sharper Shape provides?
It delayed the season for inspection, I would say. I think what ended up really happening is when you look broadly, a lot of utilities are looking at what their risk management aerial inspection programs would look like. When COVID hit, typically we tend to operate the most in the late spring through the fall. So there's a bit of a cycle that just didn't happen because everybody knew that the utilities had to continue to operate because we needed the electrons to our home. Nobody necessarily knew how that applied state by state or from a federal perspective in doing things like inspection. And so there was a little bit of a pause while everybody was figuring out what made sense. And so we really saw what would be called the bid and proposal process really taper off from, let's say, March all the way through November. And then what's happened since November, it's actually been gangbusters with all of the bids, the proposals, the inquiries. And then the other thing that's happened is just the number of countries. We were predominantly California. Now we're multiple states of inquiries and multiple countries of inquiries now. And so that's changing, but we're still in that process of decision before we actually jump into the next phase of large scale data collection.
Speaking of that next phase, what is next for Sharper Shape over the next few years?
A big part of what we're really trying to do, we'll be continuing to expand our team as we're trying to also build upon our customer base. We have been with some of the largest, most advanced utilities developing these products. And now that we've got the products that in my speak, we call an MVP, the minimum viable product, we're now at that state where we'll be approaching more utility customers in more areas to be able to provide these solutions that Sharper Shape has. As you start to think about expanding the commercial and technical footprint, of course, you need capital for that. So a big part of what we're actively doing now is we're in the process of doing a Series B capital raise. So we're going to go out in the market, try to raise tens of millions of dollars so that we can really get out there and work with utilities to show them everything that Sharper Shape has. And then ideally over the next couple of years, that takes us from a company with tens of millions of revenues to, 100 million, hopefully, or more. So that's the path that we're trying to work toward.
How does Sharper Shape use machine learning in its applications?
what we just call our AI engine because of all the places it touches in our processing. So we're really using it across 3 key areas. One area is after you go out and do a large data collection of LiDAR data, as an example, you have terabytes of data that has to be made into this digital model we talked about before. That historically has been done using a lot of manual processes. So we have used AI, machine learning algorithms to really streamline that process. And so that's a big part of what we've been developing the last 3 years. And we've gotten to a point that is significantly enhanced both the time to actually do that and then the amount of resources required to help streamline that. The other piece that we talked about already was a little bit the tree species and health identification. And again, we've done the largest in the world of anybody at doing that sort of work with AI. And then the last piece is we're now adapting those tools to really enhance component identification and defect identification. So if you imagine what we talked about before, where we can identify where there might be risks because of trees, one of the things in the United States is 25% or more of the utility assets in the United States are more than 25 years old and are in need of repair. If we can help highlight those areas of the highest risks using AI and machine learning, we can help a utility really prioritize how to go out and handle that. So that's just a couple examples of the things we're doing with artificial intelligence and machine learning at the company.
Because Sharper Shape doesn't spec so much infrastructure, is the company at a point where it can employ big data analytics and provide system-wide insights?
Yes, we're not where we'll eventually be at just because of one of the big items when you're using artificial intelligence and machine learning tools is, I always joke and say we got to feed the beast, right? You have to feed the data so that the algorithms can continue to improve. And so this is the state that we're at. Yes, at 35,000 and 800,000 structures, we've done more utility than anybody else. But to really get to where all of us want to see us get to, we need even more than that. And so this is the journey that we're on, and it can make a very, very big difference in both the micro decisions and the macro decisions for utility. And so we're definitely on that journey.
And for my final question, Chris, what message would you like to leave regarding drones and the utility industry?
With both the drone industry and the utilities, I think we are at an inflection point and a fortunate point of time that the tools that are available to us can really change the, let's say, the risk paradigm of the communities that we're all in. It is obviously a very sad occasion, whether it's a fire that is originated from a utility or Mother Nature, when we have to deal with these things. But we have the technologies available today to really help improve that situation. I think that applies on the drone side. I think it applies on the software side, the artificial intelligence side. So the more that we can do to try to make sure we can apply those in our communities, the better.
That's it for episode 319 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Chris Beaufait of Sharper Shape. I want to thank Chris for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about Sharper Shape or want to connect with Chris, check out the website at sharpershape.com. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.